Blood dripped from the forehead of Horace Miller, an 81-year-old black veteran. The porcelain coffee cup lay in shattered pieces on the cold tile floor of the Old Mariner in Savannah, Georgia. "People like you don't belong here," sneered the restaurant owner, his voice thick with contempt. In the stunned silence that followed the crash, 3 men at the next table rose, quietly, decisively, and everything began to change. No one in that cafe could have guessed that this seemingly small moment would ignite an unprecedented wave. A city awakened, a past unearthed, and a man long thought forgotten, suddenly thrust into the national spotlight. What do you think happened next? Let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit like to help spread this story. Subscribe to our channel to discover an ending no one could have imagined. Horace Miller could no longer count how many winters had passed since he returned from the battlefields of Vietnam. Each morning, when the dull ache in his left knee flared up, he was transported back to those long days stretched out on a medevac stretcher, surrounded by the whir of helicopter blades and the sharp scent of antiseptic. They say time heals all wounds, but Horace knew that some pains never fade away. They do not mark the flesh, but creep into the soul, embedding themselves deep in the memory. And perhaps the hardest pain of all is the feeling of being forgotten. He had once been a United States Navy veteran, a black man in uniform, standing amid the smoke and fire of war, beyond color, beyond titles. The day he dragged a wounded comrade from the flames, an instinctive act of courage, he was struck by a bullet, a fragment of metal lodged deep in his right leg, costing him months before he could even stand again. Even so, they pinned the Purple Heart to his chest, a gleaming piece of metal that could not conceal the truth that greeted him when he returned to Savannah, Georgia, his beloved hometown. There were no heroes' welcomes awaiting him. No flowers, no applause, no grateful gazes, only the same old streets, glances that slid past him, and a silence colder than any winter wind. He understood then that what people turned away from was not the war he had fought, but the color of his skin. Though he had sacrificed, though he had served, he remained nothing more than that black man with a cane on the corner. The wooden cane he leaned on was not bought from a pharmacy. He had carved it himself from a dry oak stump in his backyard. That stick was more than a walking aid. It was an extension of his dignity. Each step, each tap against the pavement was a silent declaration. I still exist, even if no one sees me. He lived quietly, no complaints, no tales of glory. His days passed with weak tea, the morning paper, and whispered verses from the Bible. He had grown accustomed to solitude and to that hush, until Jackson, his grandson, the treasure of his life, brought him news that set his heart racing. The boy had been accepted into a prestigious medical school, and beyond the pride, Jackson wanted to invite him to breakfast at a famed cafe in downtown Savannah, the Old Mariner. Horace hesitated for a moment. Places like that were not in his comfort zone, polished, bright, and usually off limits to men like him. But for Jackson, he nodded. And that morning, he rose earlier than usual. His shirt pressed smooth, his cane polished and each joint checked, his veteran's cap tucked carefully into his breast pocket. In the mirror, he met his own gaze. Silver hair, a strong nose, eyes deep with stories. He was still that soldier, though bent at the shoulders, though his steps had slowed. He left the house, each step deliberate on the familiar sidewalk, the left knee stabbed with pain. He paused to massage it, just as he had done hundreds of times before. But today was different. He was not out for a stroll. He was going to celebrate. to sit beside his grandson and honor his achievement, and to remind himself that his sacrifices had never been in vain. The old mariner's door emerged beyond the row of parked cars, red brick walls, a wooden sign, the soft chime of a bell as he entered. In that instant, he felt that old sense of being out of place, the air heavy with murmured conversations, the clatter of cutlery, the aroma of coffee drifting by, but no one looked up. No one noticed the silver-haired man with a cane standing tall in the doorway. He paid no mind. He stepped forward, scanning for Jackson's empty seat, his breath caught in his chest. That familiar sensation crept in, being treated as though he didn't exist. But this time, he kept moving, because Jackson was waiting, because he had promised, and because deep inside, he wanted to believe that sometimes the past could forgive, and even if no one called him a hero, he still had the right to walk in with his head held high, for he knew with every fiber of his being he had never given up. Horace stepped into the old mariner with a strange sense of dislocation. The door closed quietly behind him, leaving outside the Savannah he once knew, while inside lay a world he had never truly belonged to. Soft laughter rippled through the air, the clink of dishes. Glances cast his way before swiftly turning away. No one paid attention to the silver-haired man with his wooden cane, lean, yet still standing as straight as old military habit would allow. He moved slowly. Each strike of his cane against the cold tile sent a jolt through his left knee. Inside, he felt both hope and caution entwined. Though he was all too familiar with feeling out of place, he dared to wish that today, just today, might be an exception. Perhaps for the pride of his grandson's acceptance to medical school. Perhaps because he had chosen his finest shirt and arrived punctually, like a guest worthy of respect. But those expectations dissolved in the first look the waitress gave him. It was not a look of welcome. It was cold, indifferent, and calculating. She did not smile. She did not greet him. She simply asked his name in a flat tone, as if reading off a library return list. Then, without explanation, she turned her back and led him, not to the sunlit table by the window like the guests before him, but past row upon row of empty tables, to a secluded corner near the restroom. The solitary table was stark, a single, worn wooden chair, a distance chosen to make him feel separated, yet close enough that everyone could see the deliberate exclusion. Horace said nothing. He merely nodded, not in agreement but out of exhaustion at the thought of refusal. He eased onto the chair, grimacing as the cold bite of pain lanced through his knee. One hand gripped the cane, the other pressed lightly on the tabletop for balance. He had sat in many chairs in his life, from dusty foxholes to hospital wards, but never had a seat felt so heavy. No one brought water, no one handed him a menu. The waitress vanished as though she'd never been there. Later arrivals received smiles, kind inquiries, and steaming cups of coffee almost instantly. Conversations swelled, laughter echoed, life pulsed around him, while he sat encased in a silence as impenetrable as an invisible wall, confining him to a corner of erasure. Horace sat quietly. He removed his veteran's cap from his pocket and placed it on the table, the Navy emblem dulled by time. This was not a boastful gesture. It was a reminder to the world that he had been there, that he had fought, bled, and lost a part of himself defending this very place, and that, at the very least, he deserved a cup of coffee like anyone else in the cafe. But the cap lay there, an overlooked object. No one noticed. No one cared. It held no magic. It could not open hearts. It could not alter the waitress's glance as she swept past, feigning ignorance. Instead, it only deepened his memory that, no matter who he had been, Here he was nothing more than an old black man with a cane, sitting at the wrong table. He looked around, not with anger but with weary endurance. A familiar sensation swelled within him, being cast aside, not because he was wrong, but because no one had ever truly accepted his presence. That feeling had eaten away at his soul for 4 decades, since the day he returned, when no one called his name over a public address, no one inquired about his wounds, no one invited him to join a table, and now here he was again, sitting alone, in a cafe he did not wish to enter, yet could not bring himself to leave, because he did not want to teach Jackson that, when faced with injustice, one should silently retreat. He wanted to wait, to give them one last chance, and perhaps to prove to himself, just this once, that people could see him for who he was, rather than what he was. No matter how hard the world tried to make him vanish, he remained, silent, dignified, and unapologetic for his very existence. Jackson entered with a proud smile. He carried the innocent joy of a young man who had just achieved something monumental, a coveted spot at the prestigious medical school the whole family had dreamed of. But just a few steps into the cafe, that joy was stifled. His eyes fell upon his grandfather, sitting alone in a shadowed corner. No water, no menu, no one's concern. Horace's gaunt frame was stark against the cafe's soft light. His veteran's cap rested on the table like a silent medal, yet none spared it a glance. His face held no anger, no surprise, only the heartbreaking calm of a man long accustomed to indifference. Jackson froze in that moment. Countless tales his grandfather had told of discrimination and being ignored suddenly sprang to vivid life before him. Blood roared through the boy's veins. Injustice ignited in his chest. He strode to the counter without hesitation. Resolve burned in his eyes. His voice was not loud, but firm enough for the entire cafe to hear. "We need someone to serve my grandfather, right now." A woman emerged from behind the counter, tall, her hair pinned up, a trace of expensive perfume trailing each movement. Eileen Baxter, the owner. Jackson knew from her attitude alone. Her gaze was ice, edged like a razor, as though he were not a customer, but an unwelcome disruption in her carefully controlled world. Her voice rang out, cool and unyielding. "We have standards. Perhaps you're not accustomed to places like this." No one spoke further, but each word cut into Horace's dignity. Unspoken, everyone understood. It wasn't about attire or manners. It was a strike against the color of his skin. His very presence in this select realm was unwelcome. Time seemed to stop. Eileen lifted her hand, seized a steaming cup of coffee from the tray, and approached Horace's table. Without warning, without emotion, she flicked her wrist. The coffee sloshed over the edge, spilling across Horace's sleeve, dripping onto his weathered wrist. The porcelain shattered on the stone floor, shards skittering in every direction, a single, shattering sound, and the cafe fell silent. Horace did not flinch. He drew his arm back, wincing at the scalding heat, but his gaze never faltered. He remained serenely composed, as though he had endured far worse indignities before, as though this humiliation no longer felt unfamiliar. Jackson stiffened. His fists clenched, lips pressed so tightly they turned ashen. He was about to rush forward to shout, but before he could move, something unexpected occurred. 3 patrons rose from different tables. No words, no signal. They advanced toward Horace in unison. A white-haired man in a buttoned-up shirt. A tall black woman whose stride had the grace of a glide. A broad-shouldered Latino man whose eyes were sharp as steel. Each carried a distinct presence, Yet as they neared, their stance alone spoke volumes to everyone in the room. These were no ordinary customers. They needed no introduction. But in the military community, comrades recognize each other instantly. This was Lieutenant Colonel Ronald Hughes, veteran of the Middle East, Captain Denise Carter, the renowned field surgeon, and First Lieutenant Miguel Soto, the tactical specialist decorated for valor. They were not Horace's blood kin, but they were brothers and sisters in arms, bound by a deeper loyalty than blood. They did not scold. They did not shout. They simply stood there, steadfast, silent, like walls of protection behind Horace. Their presence was so commanding that the atmosphere seemed to sag. Other patrons looked away, unwilling to meet their eyes. The staff retreated, and Eileen remained rooted in place, her gaze wavering, as though she finally realized that today she had insulted more than an elderly black man. She had insulted a soldier, and that was unacceptable, not only to those standing beside him, but to anyone who still believed in honor, fairness, and gratitude for those who risked their lives for this country. Dear viewers, take a moment to relax or grab a sip of water before the story's next surprising turns, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see viewers join us from all over the world. Comment number 1, if you found this story compelling, so we can continue bringing you more great stories. In less than a minute, the video capturing the moment 3 patrons rose and walked toward Horace exploded across social media like sparks igniting dry straw. No filters, no commentary, just the image of an elderly black man sitting quietly with his veteran's cap, flanked by 3 figures standing tall, eyes proud, the air around them suspended. 24 hours later, the name Horace Miller was splashed across every headline. He was no longer an anonymous old man in a corner cafe. He had become the focal point, the question mark, the powerful reminder. Morning news shows, evening broadcasts, front pages of major papers, all spoke of him. Veteran faces discrimination in Southern Cafe. But that was only the surface. Beneath it rose a tidal wave of calls for justice, trending hashtags, boycott demands against the old mariner flooding every platform. People no longer remained silent. They no longer looked away. Jackson read the reports and looked at his grandfather, and for the first time saw in Horace's eyes a different kind of stillness. Not the resignation he was used to, but a pain laid bare. A hurt long buried, now exposed before millions, impossible to ignore. Yet the revelation that truly shook the nation came from a different corner. Yellowed documents in Savannah's small archives. A local historian, researching the old mariner's origins, uncovered a stunning truth. That very building, with its weathered red bricks, now at the center of controversy, had once belonged to Horace Miller's own ancestors. That man, James Miller, was a black blacksmith in the late 19th century. In the post-Civil War era, when promises of equality still hadn't blossomed, the ghosts of the past turned vengeful. James had been a respected community member, hardworking, steady, raising 7 children with calloused hands. But white supremacist groups forced him to sell his home and forge shop for a pittance to save his family's lives. And that building, where now coffee was thrown onto an elderly black veteran's hand, stood as the ruin of a historical humiliation few wished to confront. The story spread. This was not merely discrimination in a cafe. It was the haunting silence of a community broken. It was a symbol reborn. Horace's experience ceased to be only his own. It became a mirror reflecting a forgotten chapter of history, where people like him, like his forefather, had lived, been pushed aside and erased from collective memory. In his modest living room, Horace sat before the television, his hand resting on his wooden cane out of habit. The screen showed his own image, the banner reading, "From soldier to symbol." But he did not feel pride. He did not feel vindication, only the weight of stone in his chest, that after a lifetime of being forgotten and sidelined, the truth was finally being spoken. He looked out his window. Savannah's streets buzzed as always, but in the hum of horns, he heard the echo of something shifting. Not a revolution, but a crack wide enough for light to seep through. His story, from 1 minute of contempt in a cafe, had now touched millions of hearts. And as strangers began writing to him, veterans from other states called to share their solidarity. Students of color sent thanks for his stand. Horace understood. His suffering had not been in vain. Sometimes justice arrives not by bullets or courtrooms, but by truth spoken at the right moment, in the right place. And now, he was no longer the silent old man seated near the restroom in that cafe. He was a witness, a tolling bell, a wake-up call to a society still owing the past an apology. The Old Mariner Cafe closed its doors in silence. No farewells, no lengthy announcements, just panes of glass boarded up. The wooden sign that once hung proudly above the entrance, now tilted and faded under the evening sun. A place that had once symbolized exclusion, now stood as a symbol of closure. The end of an old chapter, and the promise of something new, something kinder. Yet no one could have guessed that from the ashes of a societal stain would sprout an idea with such healing power. Veterans organizations began meeting. Medical student groups sent letters filled with ideas. Communities of color, immigrants, and even those who had never cared about politics found a shared voice, all hoping for one thing: that the place which had humiliated a black veteran would now serve those who had sacrificed, regardless of race, age, or status. They proposed the establishment of the Horace Miller Veterans Support Center, not merely a facility, but a symbol, a place where those who had fought would be heard, cared for, and respected. A home for souls once wounded in silence. When the official proposal arrived on Horace's doorstep, he remained silent for a long, long time, not from surprise, but from fear. He was used to walking in darkness, to rooms where no one invited him in, to hands that never reached out. The idea of his name displayed on a large sign, the very building that had refused him service, made him uncomfortable. It conjured more memories than comfort. It reminded him of cold handshakes and disguised pity. He refused. But then the letters began to arrive, scrawled notes from elementary students, long emails from veterans in other states, recounting times they, too, had been ignored in hospitals, tearful phone calls from strangers who simply wanted to say thank you for standing your ground, of not walking away that day. And soon, he saw young people standing outside the old cafe's doors, holding signs, not shouting, but standing in silence, just as he had sat. They did not stand out of anger. They stood out of belief that the past can be healed if we look it squarely in the face. In that moment, Horace understood. This was no longer just his story, no longer a personal wound laid bare. It was a whole generation speaking through him. He nodded. On the day the Horace Miller Veterans Support Center opened, the sky was clear, a gentle breeze stirred, yet hearts surged with emotion. Hundreds flocked to that narrow Savannah street. Flags lined the sidewalks. A veterans band played the march they once knew. But the focus was not the stage, nor the mayor's speech. It was the image of a silver-haired man, cane in hand, slowly climbing the steps to the podium, before a sea of silent faces. The MC introduced him, then paused. A velvet box was brought forward. Inside lay a gleaming silver star, the decoration for the heroic deed he performed more than 50 years ago. It had been forgotten, lost in paperwork, or deliberately overlooked, but now it was being awarded, at last, to the right man, at the right time. Horace accepted it, his hand trembling slightly, yet he did not weep. He simply stood tall, meeting every gaze. Then he spoke. No microphone, no notes. "It's not that I need to be honored," he began, his voice low and raspy, yet carrying across the small square, "but because there are too many people like me, who never have the chance to speak." The crowd fell silent. In the eyes of the young, there was profound gratitude. In the eyes of fellow veterans, a quiet solidarity. And in Horace's own eyes, after everything, there was a measure of peace. Not because the pain had vanished, but because, at last, it had been named, it had been acknowledged, and it had become the first step toward something better. The grand opening of the Horace Miller Veterans Support Center was held with solemn ceremony outside the old Mariner building. The American flag fluttered proudly, the national anthem rang out, and those in line entered with hopeful eyes. Each face seemed to carry its own arduous journey, from white veterans to veterans of color and eager young volunteers. The air buzzed with excitement, tinged with nervousness and emotion. And in that moment, Eileen Baxter, the former cafe owner who had humiliated Horace and denied justice, suddenly collapsed right at the center's gate. Everything stopped. The music fell silent. Medics rushed forward. Organizers' eyes widened in alarm. Chaos reigned for seconds that stretched like hours. Mrs. Baxter lay face down, clutching her chest, her face ashen, stricken by a sudden heart attack. People hesitated, unsure what to do. Then, through the stunned hush, a familiar figure appeared. Horace, the man who had endured scalding coffee, banishment from a table, the dismissive label of just an old black man with a cane, was the first to spring into action. He knelt beside her, letting his cane clatter onto the pavement. Beads of sweat dotted his brow. His heartbeat stuttered, yet his hand never wavered as he found her pulse. He pressed his ear to her chest, counting each beat. Then, with steady resolve, he issued precise instructions. "Maintain the rhythm. 2 compressions per second." His voice trembled but remained clear. He didn't stop until the wail of the ambulance siren roared in the background. The crowd stood speechless. Some turned away, others wept. A few grasped each other's hands for warmth. All eyes were fixed on Horace, the once rejected man, now saving the very person who had rejected him. Once Mrs. Baxter was loaded into the ambulance, still in pain, still confused, but finally receiving the care she deserved, Horace rose to his feet. The late afternoon light stained his face. Each wrinkle bore the imprint of time and experience. He did not wipe away his sweat. He made no perfunctory effort at courtesy. He simply stood, upright as a pillar, in a silence long enough to speak volumes. When asked about his actions afterward, he offered only 2 sentences. "I did it because it was right. I didn't want to become like those who treated me so." His voice was low. His hand still bore the faint stain of coffee from that earlier indignity, a stain now washed away by what he had done. Those present that day no longer held back. They burst into applause, many with tears in their eyes. Some veterans shook his hand, embraced him as if to lift the weight he had carried for so long. Young volunteers flocked to ask if he was all right, if he needed anything. It was a scene of profound beauty. The man in his neatly pressed shirt, his veteran's cap now worn with solemn pride, a living emblem of renewed hope. The storyteller's gaze drifted to the steps behind him, where Mrs. Baxter stood trembling in her plain black dress, her eyes glistening as if astonished by the compassion of the man she had once demeaned. A brief moment, yet enough for everyone to grasp that forgiveness is not weakness. On the contrary, it is proof of strength. That evening closed with an unforgettable tableau. Horace, standing at the center's entrance, looking out at those arriving with admiration in their eyes. Young people stepped inside, carrying dreams, gratitude, and faith. White veterans took their place beside veterans of color. Medical students, doctors, former military medics, and even young immigrants laid their hands upon the dedication plaque. All of them looked to one man, Horace, the once forgotten veteran who had become a symbol of what America still strives for, justice entwined with compassion. A single photograph of him bent over Mrs. Baxter, administering chest compressions with unwavering focus, was captured and shared that very night. The image, an instant testament to a righteous act, soon adorned the center's walls alongside the names of those who had borne witness to that day. If this story has touched you, please subscribe so we can share more moving tales like this. And don't forget to comment below. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there? The reach of stories like these depends on you. Share this video with loved ones, especially in the United States, to remind each other that forgiveness and kindness hold more power than any glory.